Hey listeners, have you heard of a surprising event referred to as a kismet moment when fate, destiny, or maybe just a lucky coincidence seems to bring people or circumstances together? It describes a magical meant-to-be spark. In adoption, there are a ton of these kismet moments, and I want to hear them. An adoptee who found out her biological sister had lived down the street from her entire childhood. A family who called the agency to say they were done, and the agency called them back the next week with a baby born. A birth mom who chose a family out of hundreds, and when she told them the name she'd chosen for her baby, they'd already picked the same one. I'm collecting these kinds of moments for an upcoming episode of the Adoption Roadmap. The moments in adoption that feel less like luck and more like the universe had a plan all along. If you have a moment to share, press pause right now. Go ahead, press pause. Click on the link in the show notes and submit yours today. Now back to the show. At 3 years old, in the middle of an hour-long meltdown, Teresa's son looked up at her and said something that still brings tears to her eyes today. "I want to calm down, Mommy, but I don't know how." Teresa's a social worker. She's spent years in child welfare before she ever became a mom, and even she was lost. Her son was born opioid dependent, and the hospital sent her home with a promise she'd hear over and over from doctors. He'll go through withdrawal, and then he'll be fine. That's more or less something I've also heard about opioid-exposed children. That turned out to be one of the biggest myths in adoption today, and Theresa Harmon has spent the last decade fighting it. In this episode, we get honest about what prenatal opioid exposure actually means, what even counts as an opioid, what the research really shows, not the terrifying Google version and not the everything's fine after the NICU version, but the truth that lives somewhere in the middle. Why your pediatrician might miss things and how to advocate when they do. The early services that change everything and the myths that hurt these kids most. If you've been presented an adoption situation with exposure and you're trying to decide whether to move forward or not, or you're already parenting a child who was exposed, I hope this episode will be as helpful for you as it was for me. Before we get started, I want to say thank you. Thank you to our reviewer, Dolly X Lama. She reviewed the podcast with a 5-star rating and said, "Highly recommend the Adoption Roadmap podcast. Adoption is confusing and overwhelming, but Rebecca has helped clear up many of our questions. Must listen for anyone considering adoption." Well, thank you, Dolly X Lama. I so appreciate your rating and review and for taking the time to do so. If you like this podcast as much as Dalai Lama does, please follow suit and leave us a rating and review. Now let's get into the episode. Welcome to the Adoption Roadmap podcast. Your dream is to become a parent. My dream is to help you get there. I'm Rebecca Greenspan, an adoptive mom who's guided over 500 families through the beauty and complexity of adoption. Through my work with families and professionals across the country, I've seen what actually moves people forward and what holds them back. Each week, I bring you practical advice, expert voices from all sides of adoption, and the positivity you need to navigate your journey with clarity, confidence, and trust. Let's get into it. Teresa, I'm so excited that you said yes to my ask today because I think you're going to be able to share so many golden nuggets with our listeners today because of your personal experience. So I'm just going to get right to the juice of it and present you with a scenario, if that's okay. A hopeful adoptive parent calls you because they've been presented an opportunity of matching with a mama whose baby will be exposed to opioids, and they're trying to decide whether or not to move forward. Or maybe the baby was already born The baby's exposed, but they weren't expecting that. What do you tell the family? And does it matter if the baby was already born, that second scenario, or they haven't yet matched?
So I don't think that it necessarily matters so much as, obviously if the baby's not born yet, you have a little bit more time to prepare yourself. But I think, the most important thing to know is that you should absolutely consider taking a prenatally exposed child who has been exposed to opioids. I think as foster parents, we have, and adopted parents, we have such a great opportunity to help these kids, but these kids in particular, I think we have an even greater opportunity to really affect their lives and to make sure that they reach their full potential. But I think it's important to know, first and foremost, that these kids, in, the positive sides of things, that they're empathetic, they're kind, they're resilient. There are all these wonderful things, despite some of the things that we're going to talk about that they may need help with. But those things that they need help with, if we provide early services for them, they can do really great.
Would you ask these parents particular questions about them to be prepared, or are there certain things that a family should be prepared of or should ask themselves before agreeing to move forward with the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, hopefully the child welfare system that you're working within, or, if it's a private adoption, has done a good job of preparing you for the needs of these children. Maybe not, but the kinds of things that you're likely to see are, some moderate educational, developmental, and behavioral health needs. And so ensuring that you're prepared to be able to provide those services for these kids, and that that that's not going to disrupt whatever else you have going on in your family, because those services are incredibly important for our kids.
Yeah. Learning is a big one I've heard as far as learning disabilities and behavior as far as neurodiversity issues that come up. Are there any other big factors that we're just talking about opioid exposure, and we're going to get a little bit more into that, but is there anything else that they can either expect or think about that could happen that
Yeah,
they
I
could
mean, as
see?
far as, so we've done our own research, and, what we've found is that these kids, talking to families that we work with, our kids, they have gross motor delays. So there are kids that may ride a bike late, that may get to kindergarten despite services and still have trouble with writing because they've got that hypertonia, or which is just a fancy word for, being very stiff in the upper body, not and so
I've never heard that, but there are a lot of fancy words
yeah,
in this
there's a lot of
industry.
fancy
But I've
words.
never heard of that one. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so our kids are often, because of their exposure, they can be born really tight. And so, they might require physical therapy to help loosen them up. But even despite that, if you're tight in your core, it can affect your ability to write. So you may see things like dysgraphia, which is similar to dyslexia, where kids are having trouble with writing, they're having trouble getting the information from their brain to the pen. You could see, like those behavioral health issues. Our number one diagnosis beyond the NAS diagnosis or the prenatal opioid exposure diagnosis is ADHD. Number two is often autism spectrum disorder. So, thinking about those conditions and what you tend to see with that dysregulation and needing, supports to learn how to regulate their body, and, potentially medication if that's the route that families decide to go to help kids, kind of calm their nervous system. So, and then when you get to the educational system, working with school-based providers who don't fully understand our kids and having to be a really good advocate for them. The things that kids experience. We've had twins in our study, and even despite being twins, they have different outcomes. The thought is that it is based on, timing of exposure, type of exposure, the placenta, which helps to, filter out toxins. So those are some of the things that are being looked at as potential factors and kind of the outcomes that we see for kids.
So when you say autism spectrum, isn't ADHD on that spectrum?
No, they're two separate conditions, but they both,
That's interesting because I've heard two different things, and sometimes I get really confused that I thought now they have included ADHD as part of that talk of spectrum. But okay, you're saying otherwise. If we are talking about two different things, when you say autism spectrum, I believe there's a wide spectrum, right?
Yeah. So, and the difference, just so that people understand, so
Yeah.
autism is essentially seen as a communication disorder. So you may see a lot of ADHD type behaviors like the dysregulation, the hyperactivity, those kinds of things. But those kids tend to also, in addition, have difficulty with communicating socially, understanding social cues, social pragmatics. So there's that piece to it that ADHD doesn't have. And there's a lot of kids that have, comorbid ADHD and autism, and that, is very common.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for clearing that up. Speaking of clearing things up, let's talk about opioid exposure for a minute because opioid exposure includes a lot of different substances. Can you talk about what some of those drugs are that
Yeah,
we are
so
talking about?
Yeah, so they can be prescribed or they can be, illicit substances. So you could see somebody who is using heroin that they get, from the street, or it could be a parent who's been prescribed medication for pain and so their child was exposed prenatally. So, oxycodone, Dilaudid, medications like that. And
Heroin is an opioid?
yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And so, and again, they haven't looked at it that closely, but there is some literature that suggests that based on the type of opioid, that it may affect different parts of the brain. And so that also may be a piece of why we see different symptoms in kids.
Fentanyl is part of that too, right?
Yeah, and so with fentanyl, we tend to see, and this is not academic, scientifically published, but just from like our day-to-day working with these kids. Kids that are exposed to fentanyl, we tend to see a lot more hyperactivity, inattention, more of those ADHD symptoms, trouble with sleep. So I find that when kids are exhibiting extreme behaviors, it's often because they've been exposed to fentanyl, or they also have been exposed to alcohol and have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or they've been exposed to, some extensive trauma. We see, those are all brain-based pieces. And so it kind of exacerbates what we generally see in kids that are, I should say, just opiate exposed, but it can make symptoms a lot worse. So, thinking about all those factors and how they roll into what we're seeing behaviorally.
Yeah, and it certainly depends whether or not we're talking about a child who's already been born and exposed to different lived traumas versus also being in a traumatic experience inside their mom. That mom could be living a very chaotic life and experiencing that trauma too. And that plays part of it, right? When we talk about trauma, it's both lived and not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so a study that has always stuck with me, they had looked at, I believe it was rats, and what they found was when they exposed mother rats to a specific trauma that were pregnant, and those babies that were later born, whatever the stimuli was that they were exposed to that caused trauma, even though the babies had never been with mom, they still exhibited signs of trauma related to that same stimuli that they had been exposed to. So I think that says a lot about, generational trauma or even, in utero trauma.
Yeah, and that's the whole primal wound idea as well. Is it important for a parent to know exactly what their child was exposed to versus just they were exposed to opioids? Because typically when we see a situation, it'll say mom has been, this baby has been exposed to opioids or something. Is it?
I think as we move forward and we start to continue to study things further, that it will be important, because I think that we will gather more information about the more specific effects of each of these medications. It's definitely being looked at. So I think it can be really helpful information to have.
Because typically what I have heard, and maybe you disagree, and I'm hearing a little bit of that, but is typically kids who are exposed to opioids do very well developmentally beyond an initial withdrawal from whatever drugs, as well as a heightened risk of ADHD.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I would firmly disagree with that. And that is what I have been unfortunately fighting against for families for the last 10 years. Doctors who work in neonatology will say that there is no long-standing consequences. However, they don't go home with these kids. I live with 3 of them. And I work with, hundreds, if not thousands of kids that have been born with prenatal opioid exposure and have seen the complete opposite. And I think, just by being a neonatologist, you're not seeing kids into pediatrics. So for them to make statements like that, I think is really confounding. I think that the narrative needs to change. These kids, not all of them, but most of them, do suffer some consequences. And, I think that the reason why it's not talked about is because providers feel like they're stigmatizing moms if they talk about it. But I think it's really important that we do, because moms are important. They did the best that they could when they, went on to prescribed opiates, or if they were in the throes of addiction. They've all done the best that they could, and they shouldn't, feel poorly about it. But if we don't talk about the needs of these kids, we're doing a huge disservice to them. They need the help, they need the support, and we need to have, a plan for care for these kids, and providers who understand how to take care of them.
I'm processing all of this in my brain, and I think that there's a couple things going on. I think maybe the narrative has been going on for so long that people don't know to question it or don't know anything more, maybe, and maybe that's a problem or not. The other thing is there are so many moms, and I'm finding that it's mostly the white moms that are taking opioids of some shape or form, that you almost have to be open to it if you want to adopt, especially a white baby. Now, I'm speaking very generally, but I see a ton of situations, and I have for the last 13 years. And yeah, so this is all very interesting to me. First of all, do you agree with that statement on race?
Yeah, I think, we know that the opioid crisis started generally around 2010, that it seemed to disproportionately affect Caucasians. I think that there are certainly, outliers to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And thank you for confirming that, because I think some people, I've written that before, and people read it and they're appalled. And I'm like, okay, you could be appalled. I'm just telling you what I see and what I've experienced. What do you think? And maybe it's not that easy. I've also heard, every child is different. So to say you're going to experience one of these things, you may not. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And, what is the harm in being prepared?
Hey, real quick, if you're listening to this podcast because you're seriously considering adoption, you don't have to figure this out alone. At RG Adoption Consulting, my team and I guide hopeful families through every step of the adoption process using our proven 4-step roadmap. In 2025, 62% of our families brought their baby home within 12 months. If that sounds like something you're ready for, we'll help you figure out your next best steps. Book a complimentary adoption strategy session at rgadoptionconsulting.com. So take us back. You're a social worker. You've worked for many years in child welfare. You adopt your son. He's born dependent on opioids. And even with all your training, you're feeling a little lost. So What happened and why did that turn into a whole organization that you started?
Yeah, I mean, we took my first son home 13 years ago from the hospital. And like you stated previously, we're told that everything's going to be great. They're going to go through withdrawal and then you're fine. I had worked, like you said, in child welfare. At that point, we didn't really talk about kids with prenatal opioid exposure. It wasn't, just kind of flew under the radar. But our experience was that we came home and it doesn't just end in the NICU. What we experienced was we got early intervention the very first day that we got home. They were very helpful. However, when they left, we really struggled even more. I think that 3-year-old stage when early intervention ends is particularly difficult. Our families that we have studied have said, things like that they feel like they fell off a cliff, that they had to go to war for services, that they had to fight. It's all these terms about how, difficult it is to find and access services. These kids also are 3 years old. Developmentally, we expect a lot more from kids. And so I think that that's really where we get called a lot, because kids are getting kicked out of daycare. They're aggressive. They're, having issues with their peers, when really what we're seeing is dysregulation that is sensory based. But getting back to kind of like my story, I couldn't find what I needed. I talked to school, I talked to daycare, I talked to my pediatrician, and they couldn't tell us what to expect or things that would help. There was no preparation, and I just knew that if I couldn't find what I needed, that other families were struggling in the same way. So we started with a support group, and families came out en masse, and they described extremely similar symptoms that I was seeing in my son. They described not being able to access the care that they needed. And so from that, we established the nonprofit and built services based on the express needs of our family, and created, not only services, but a community of people that understand the needs of these kids.
Tell me about that organization.
So To the Moon and Back, this will actually be our 10th year. We're a nonprofit. We're based out of Plymouth, Mass, but we've always served the entire country in whatever way we can. We provide information to other states about the work that we do, what's been helpful. We work with Child Trends out of Bethesda, Maryland, who helps us collect data. We had established all these great programs, but we really wanted to show the needs of these kids and what was helping them. So we have a variety of services. One of the ones that I'm most proud of is our case management program. Any child here in Massachusetts that has a history of prenatal opioid exposure receives, if they choose, a case manager who's a clinical social worker and also raising children with prenatal opioid exposure, who's able to help them navigate these, difficult systems, educate them on some of the long-term consequences that we see for kids, help them with behavioral intervention, observe them at school, help with IEPs, 504s, so they, really can do an awful lot. And then the other piece of that program is that we continue to educate what we've seen in our research with providers in the community, so that there continues to develop a community of providers who understand how to take care of our kids to refer our families to.
Wow, that's incredible. And you alluded earlier to how difficult it is, which is why you started this, to find programs and need. And part of that is not knowing exactly how to advocate, because as a new parent, you have no idea what these kids need. And you look to your doctor, to your pediatrician to tell you. And if that's not their specialty, they're looking at it as any other child, and not understanding the needs of our children. I always tell people, and I love that you brought this up, to get early child intervention, number one, to just create that paper trail, because you're talking about how hard it is after you stop getting those services. Imagine if you never had those services to even have a paper trail. So now you have to start that. And so you're starting from scratch. How do you work with families outside of your area?
Yeah, so we get calls from across the country. We kind of always have, and we let them know kind of about what we are working on here, what services we have in place. met with physicians who work in the area of development, and we provide them with ideas about how to best support our kids. We help families think about different programs in their own states that might be available to them. We talk about we talk about the things that we generally see in our kids, because I think there's always that question of like, is this typical development? Is this based on the exposure? So we're able to kind of confirm that and walk parents through it. And then like another piece of it that we try to do is support other states if they want to build something like what we have. We have a chapter in West Virginia that we established several years ago out of, the needs that they had there.
Oh my God, I love that. How are you able to tell whether it's typical child behavior or otherwise?
Based on research. When I first started this, there was like barely any research. There's been a lot of attention paid lately. And so like particularly MRI brain studies that are looking at the differences with these kids with, typically developing children. There's been a lot of education-based research that has shown that essentially, like, I always call it like the no-brainer studies. Essentially, like the longer you delay in providing kids with supports in school, the bigger the education gap gets. They, have looked at different areas in time and found that. So,
oh my goodness, that is worth repeating right there. Say that again.
yeah, the longer you wait, the bigger the educational gap gets. So investing in these kids early and often is so, so important. And we've also done our own research with child trends. And so, we share out that information. We publish academically. We have 2 studies published now. And, we were able, when we did that research study, I knew that some of the most important things were going to be to control for polysubstance exposure and for trauma, because all I constantly hear is that what we see in these kids is because of trauma. What we see in these kids is because of tobacco use. Well, I'm sure that those are certainly all factors, but our study showed that it is, when we control for all those factors, there's still long-term consequences because of opioid use.
And your studies are just with children who were adopted, yes?
So we do open it to any child with exposure.
Because I'm wondering if adoption plays into that as well. Like if there's any specific adoption related trend you see there.
It has been very difficult to be able to get, families that are, non-foster adoptive or kinship to participate. We opened our study up to them, and it unfortunately was a pretty small sample of them. And I think that it speaks less to, is it adoption trauma versus our families not talking about the needs of the kids in their care because they're scared of DCF, because, they aren't fully educated on what they're seeing. And so they're not getting, the services or the supports that they need for these kids.
I would love if you can to send me some links to some of these studies, because it's really not easy to find, even when you're Googling it. And I don't know if there's any organizations that did research that you want to mention now, but we'll try to link some of these in the show notes. So there's a lot of scary stuff online and also misleading stuff, as we have already talked about. So cutting through the fear, and I know you've talked in general, but what does the actual research tell us about the effects short term versus the effects long term? And are those numbers going up or are they going down? Because I feel like recently I've seen a decline in opioid use in adoption, which is great. It's the first time in many years now. It's certainly not gone, but we are seeing more and more adoption situations with no exposures, which is great. But long versus short term, what's the research actually saying versus maybe even versus what you're seeing? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't follow it as closely as maybe I should, just because I'm in the trenches and I'm just kind of taking care of these kids and families. But from what I understand, at least here in Massachusetts, the numbers are declining. Even more importantly, the numbers of individuals that are overdosing and dying has decreased. So what we're doing, putting that money into prevention and substance use disorder is really working, which kind of brings me to the idea of, we've got all these opioid abatement funds and more of that money needs to go to these kids because we know that genetically children, regardless of this history, that have parents that struggled with substance use disorder are genetically more likely to have substance use disorder. So this is like prevention upon prevention, taking care of these kids and making sure some of those opioid dollars go to these kids. So that's really important work. As far as short-term and long-term outcomes, I don't know of any studies really that specifically just hone in on the short-term outcomes. I think that they're really trying to look at the more broad long-term outcomes now. We've gotten to that point, which is really important because these kids are getting older. Again, opioid crisis 2010, we're looking at kids now that are in middle school. And so what does that look like to our educational systems? How does that affect them? What can we put in place to support middle schools? And then all those kids, that are still coming down the pipe, that are elementary school, daycare, and making sure that we have adequate support for teachers.
In your own experience, what do parents usually see, or what did you see when you first brought your baby home and in those first couple years versus later on? And how old are your kids now?
13, 8, and 2.
Okay, so you have a little bit of a spectrum there as far as ages. So what do you see early on versus what you've been experiencing, and even with some of these other kids?
So it's been a little different with each of my kids. And so like my oldest, I think, was the most significantly affected. Came home, he was very dysregulated. He's very, very smart, very high IQ. Our kids, it's not like FASD where IQ is affected. Like that remains intact for our kids, which is such a great protective factor. But what we saw with him is like he would be 3 years old and the length and intensity of the meltdowns that he would have, I mean, it would be like an hour. But the saddest thing, and I'll try not to cry because whenever I tell this, I always get a little tearful. At 3 years old, he would tell me, I want to calm down, but I don't know how to.
Wow.
So, it really is it's really held and stored in your body, just like trauma. And that dysregulation kind of continued. And, some of the other things, were related to when he was later diagnosed with autism, trouble with feeding and being extremely sensitive, thinking he was going to choke on foods, and trouble with peer interactions. I always say that a lot of times, like our kids, they really work really hard to get back on track with some of these developmental delays that they have. They work so hard that the social kind of falls to the wayside. So he had, at birth a lot of hypertonia. So he was delayed in basically every stage, crawling, walking. And then, he has struggled with dysgraphia, with learning disabilities. So those are some of the things that we've dealt with over the years.
And is that pretty common from what you've seen with other families?
Yeah, it definitely can be, And I, in my current practice as a psych nurse practitioner, I specialize in kids that are adopted in foster care and have prenatal opioid exposure. So I see a lot of kids, and like a lot of hyperactivity, inattention, dysregulation, a lot of autism diagnoses, a lot of needs to be a really creative parent in how, we support these kids. Square peg, round hole. Like our kids' brains are just a little different. And so we just need to accommodate, how we work with them and understand, neuropsych is a great opportunity to, I think parents often think of it as like, oh, this is going to diagnose and I don't want this diagnosis, or this is going to talk about all the things they don't do well. It also tells you all the great things that your kid is really capable of so that you can, work within those protected pieces to help our kids.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to go back and read mine from second grade. He's now 15, but I'm curious now to see what still rings true and what doesn't. Can we talk about withdrawal for a minute? Because that's the first thing a parent will go through, right, with their child. And I've learned a lot about that over the years as far as what does a parent see? I'm going to let you describe it. But what does a parent see when a baby is withdrawing?
So at the hospital level, we see something a little bit different than we would have seen with my 13-year-old. At least here in Massachusetts, we're using Eat, Sleep, Console, which interestingly, the doctors who established it have always kind of thought just more as a screening tool. So instead of the Finnegan, which is how we used to score these kids to decide if they would get additional postnatal opioids to help them with the weaning process off of opioids, that, we used to look at 21 different various factors like sneezing, GI upset, and things like that. And so a lot more kids based on those factors were given additional opioids. Now with Eat, Sleep, Console, we look at how well they eat, how well they sleep, and can they calm themselves down when they get dysregulated within 15 minutes. And so a lot less kids are getting postnatal opioids. And so as I was kind of alluding to, like Eat, Sleep, Console is sensory-based interventions for these kids that are used in the hospital by the nurses, but they can also be used by families, which I've pointed out to them, but I think initially they didn't realize that they had created this great package too of things that would help families.
That's the name of a product, Sleep Console?
Eat, Sleep, Console. It's how
Eat, Sleep, Console.
Yeah, ESC. So it's how most hospitals score their kids to decide if they need postnatal opioids, but it also includes things like swaddling, dim lighting, rooming in with parents versus being in the separate NICU. It really focuses on some of these more holistic ways to support kids and, letting them have a bit of discomfort, but not too much discomfort, and, teaching parents some of these skills for when they come home. So I think that we're doing a better job of kind of teaching families how to help even babies regulate. And that's really important because as our kids get older, I always say that the things that you see that worked well for your child often translate to them as they get older. So for instance, like if your child really enjoyed swaddling, a lot of times, deep pressure, weighted blankets, sensory sacks, those things can still help them because it's a skill that they learned when they were younger about regulation.
What are some of the other things that are included in this that you would teach a new parent to do when they come home with their baby, if their baby was exposed?
So it also included the ability for moms that wanted to breastfeed their children, because there used to be this idea that, that was not good for kids. But what they actually found is that, that little bit of opioid that is being expressed in breast milk actually keeps kids more comfortable and that they're less likely to need.
From birth mom. Okay. I thought you were talking about adoptive parents, because that's a thing too sometimes that they can do that. Okay.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about, I want to get back to that in 1 second, but when you were talking about trying not to use other opioids to wean them off, is that morphine? Is that what you're talking about typically? Is morphine an opioid? Is that what
It depends on the hospital. Morphine or methadone, typically.
Okay.
Sometimes they also use additional medications, but
Okay.
that's typically what they use. I think a lot more hospitals now are using methadone. So methadone wasn't used as much because what it showed was worse cognitive outcomes. The reason why was because there's alcohol content in methadone. So
interesting.
Jonathan Davis at Tufts New England Medical Center created
we knew you'd find it. Would you find
a
it?
formulation that removed that content. So a lot of hospitals are using that now.
So cool. All the things that I learned. Okay, so going back to what are some of the other things? I love giving my listeners some tactical. So what are some of the other things that they can do when they come home?
Yeah, so coming home, our kids, I always laugh because I hold other people's babies that aren't born prenatally exposed to opioids, and I'm always in movement. Our kids love movement. They're like, "Why are you moving?" I'm like, "Because isn't this just what you do with babies?"
Yeah, I thought so.
Our babies, and every kid's different. Like my kid hated touch, but like skin to skin can be really important. Being considerate of your sensory environment, like lower lighting, softer sound, things like that. Things that maybe you don't think about as far as like smell or, even for a baby, like transitioning things more slowly for them, that can all help get through that withdrawal phase for sure.
I love that. And I love that there's different options now. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
Um,
think baby wearing is another really, important one.
what's what's something that you think people believe about opioid exposed kids that's flat out wrong?
I think it can go in both directions. I think
Yeah.
either they think that they're, you know, not going to have any needs after the NICU, or I think that some people might think that they're going to have a crazy amount of needs. And I think the reality is that, kind of what I mentioned before, that with the right services, with the right early services, that our kids can do really great. They're really incredible individuals.
And I think that's interesting because it seems to me that opioid exposure falls right in between that, right? Whereas maybe something like FASD is more on the heightened experience for parents. With opioid exposure, it can be heightened, it can be nothing, but typically you're going to find your kids right in that the middle there where you are going to need some services, but they're more manageable. It's not going to, for the most part, and I don't know, I'm about to make this up, so tell me if I'm wrong. For the most part, it won't completely disarm your life. What's the word I'm looking for? They're manageable.
Yeah, I mean, that has been my experience. I think it's been the experience of some other families, but I think, it all comes down to how equipped you are, what, additional
Yeah.
concerns there might be.
The layering
So,
of the trauma, the
yeah,
drug,
so
the
I think it's just important I think that what you're saying is absolutely true, but I think for families that really do struggle at a more heightened level, I don't want to dismiss them either because it can be really
absolutely. And that's with anything, right? There's always going to be people with different experiences on average. So what is it that parents should be, first of all, going back to whether your kids are exposed or not exposed? If your child came to you through adoption, start early childhood intervention. It's there for you. You can get it. That is a trauma in their life that will be considered, and you can get it. You don't
yeah.
know what's going to come of your children at that point.
Yeah,
Do you?
100% get them screened. Something really unique that we have here, I don't know if other states have it, is that with a diagnosis of true opioid dependence or NAS, NOWS, kids are eligible here in Massachusetts for at least 1 year of early intervention without having to screen in. We've actually worked for several years with the legislature to try to get that for automatic eligibility for 3 years for any kind of exposure, including alcohol, including, amphetamines, whatever the exposure is, because these kids need it. But that there's no state that has that now. So it would be really trailblazing for our state to do that. And it's literally been in the legislature for several years now, but hasn't gotten passed.
Is there anything we can do? Do you have any links or anything that we can write or call or?
Yeah, I can take a look and see where things are this year and
Yeah.
definitely send you the information.
Okay, awesome. So, what do we need to watch out for in our children, whether it's related to learning or behavior? And so, what do we need to look out for, and what can we be doing early on?
So I think that not so much what to look out for, but to know that the people that you trust, the pediatricians, the schools, they may minimize what you're seeing. They may not, and that's not purposeful. It's because they
Yeah.
don't understand. So I think it's really important to be a really strong advocate for your kid, to know what they need and to not let it go. Just to give an example, I had a kid who from very early on struggled with feeding, talked to their pediatrician about it pretty regularly and had some pretty deep concerns about it that were brushed off. And then and that was from birth. And then as they got older and, were in their, 9, 10 years old, became even more rigid with their eating and lost 20% of their body weight. And only then, was an intervention provided. So having faith that you know your child and that you know what they need. Medical professionals, they are fallible. Some of them believe that they aren't. I feel like nowadays more of them understand that they miss things sometimes and listen to parents, but you know your heart, you know your kid. So go with your gut.
And more, I'm finding that if you know your child was exposed, if you know your child was adopted, and I hope you know that, find professionals that have experience with that. I never really thought it was that important, but I'm really starting to change my mind on that. And because I just figured doctors know about this stuff, and it's so not true.
It's the healthcare system. We get 15-minute, 30-minute appointments if we're
Right.
lucky. They're expected to know everything about everything, and that's just not possible. So sometimes we have to educate them.
And when would you say is the right time to get a neuropsych evaluation, or does every child need that if they were exposed or not?
I mean, our recommendation has always been, if you're seeing things that seem a little bit unusual, we recommend that you try to get one around 4, knowing that when you start that process at 4, they're probably not going to see until they're 5 or 6. But I think it's really important to get that baseline. I think it's really important, especially parents who've been struggling to understand their child's brain, so that they don't feel like they're fighting a fight alone, and that they can figure out better ways to work with their child.
First of all, ask your teachers too. Your children. I always thought, especially in the early years, it was really important for me to let the teachers know a little bit about my child. And I remember asking the teacher questions about, where do you think he is? Is he struggling? Is he blah, blah, blah? And she's the one who told me at second grade. And I thought, that is way too young. But at second grade, she said, go get him tested. And I'm thinking to myself, really? I mean, isn't he just a kid? And I did. And I still didn't believe it because I still thought, oh, that's really young. And so I did it again. And guess what happened 2 or 3 years later? It was the same outcome. So they were right. The other thing I was going to throw in, and as far as trusting your gut and knowing your kids, is sometimes we put our kids into schools, and maybe I'm talking from personal experience, that we think, oh my God, what a great opportunity, a private school or this school or that school, and they're struggling, and it's okay to say this may not be the right fit. And changing schools might be a great thing for your child. It was for us, and that's not an easy thing to do. You want the consistency, you want them to keep their friends, you want their environment to stay the same. And if they're struggling so much in certain areas, it may just not be the right fit for them. Would you agree? Yeah. We talked about seeing specialists, pediatricians, other doctors that specialize. How does one go about finding that? What questions should we be asking our pediatricians?
I think it's important to ask if they've worked with adoptive kids, foster kids, if they have experience working with kids that have prenatal opioid exposure or, other substances. But I think even if they don't, I think what's more important is that they're willing to collaborate with you and listen to you. I think those are the most important pieces, because a doctor that's willing to learn is just as good as one that knows everything.
Well, yeah, and I have found a number of people who are like, oh, yeah, I've worked with a lot of adopted kids before, or kids who were adopted before, which to me kind of brushes it off and tells me nothing. I want to know that they have experience, or they have studied it, or that they know there can be some differences from kids who were not, or kids who were not, were exposed versus kids that are not. Do they know how to treat that differently? Or have they just seen patients who have been adopted? There's two different things there. Are there things that we can ask or do or look for that get down to that?
I honestly don't know.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's okay.
I don't have an answer for that. I think it just, it depends on the family and the feeling that you get with the person. I know, for me, I had a pediatrician who I thought was a good listener, but she never followed through on anything. She didn't seem to understand the needs of my kids, and so we switched. And
Yeah.
now we have a better fit. I think, sometimes it's just trial and error.
I went to a psychiatrist once as we were thinking about meds and trying meds on for size. And she really was like, yeah, this has nothing to do with adoption. Like, this is an adoption thing. And I'm like, okay, we got to go. Like, we need somebody new because I politely disagree. And at least without really knowing my kid, no, I don't, you can't say that. You don't know.
Yeah,
I
100%.
mean, maybe not. Anyways, anything else you think is really important for our parents to know?
So one of the things I didn't talk about was we're finding, and I know Perkins School for the Blind is also finding it, that there is a high rate of a condition called a cortical visual impairment, which is a neurological eye disorder that our kids are more likely to have. And so, that's important for obvious reasons, vision, ability to sit and attend in school. It also plays into when we think about if a child has ADHD, if they're not seeing properly and their eyes are, working more than they need to, behaviors can look like ADHD when really it's an underlying eye disorder.
What is it called and what exactly is it?
A cortical visual impairment, it's a neurological eye disorder where the information from the eye doesn't necessarily get to the brain, is my basic understanding of it. But there are people
Okay.
that are far more versed in this than me. Some of the signs of it seem to be strabismus, so like eyes going out.
You're using lots of funny words. Okay. The eyes that go out to different, both peripherally.
Or it could just be one.
Okay.
Nystagmus, so vision issues overall. So if your child has a vision issue, it would be important to get them screened by somebody who understands CVI or cortical visual impairments to make sure that that's not the issue that you're seeing.
Could that also come up, like if because I know a lot of schools give these screenings now, and if your child has a screening at school, would it come up as nearsighted or farsighted, or would they see it as, oh, I don't see any problem?
I mean, I think
You
with,
know?
and again, like I think optometry or ophthalmology could speak better to this, but
Yeah.
I think if you're seeing any kind of vision issue, it would still be important to get screened for this condition. Just
Yeah.
in the general population, not including our kids, it's grossly underdiagnosed, but a risk factor is certainly prenatal exposure.
Awesome. Well, this has been lots of golden nuggets, very interesting, and I'm constantly learning, and my mind is, I don't know, starting to shift a little bit in all of this, and I wish there was more research to point to exactly what, and at the same time, while maybe I'm coming away with it thinking there's more to it long term than maybe we've heard or we've understood. It's also, for the most part, manageable if you are aware of what to look for and the tools to put in place.
100%. With anything within public health, prevention is so important. Understanding the condition, treating it, and making sure kids have supports.
Awesome. Do you work mostly with the kids or the parents or both?
Both, really. I mean, we do kids groups where, we take 40 kids that have a history of prenatal opioid exposure into all sorts of different events once a month. We work with families through our case management program, through our support groups, supporting them and helping them, figure out how to support kids and make sure that they're taking care of themselves too.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have an Instagram? where people can find you?
Yeah, so we have an Instagram, Facebook page. So it's both are at To the Moon MA. And then we also have a private Facebook group for families, and that is at To the Moon MA. No, wait.
No, that's the other one.
It is at Beyond MAS. And we also have a website where we provide a bunch of information as well. That's www.tothemoonandback.org.
We will link all of that. Thank you so much. What a great resource for so many families. So if this is speaking to you, find your community. It's so important to be among other people who are experiencing similar things or who may be ahead of you and have found solutions that might work for you too. Teresa, before I let you go, have a couple quick fire round questions. And the first one, here we go, hot seat. Give a shout out to one person or organization other than your own that has influenced your adoption journey or the work you're doing in adoption.
Back to early intervention. I think, those were our first helpers. So, here in our area, it's Kennedy Donovan Center. So,
Love it. What's one piece of advice for hopeful adoptive parents that you would give to them, even if they don't want to hear it?
just general adopted parents, I think, it took us 3 years to get my middle son. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I think that God has a plan and He puts the children that are meant to be with us when the time is right.
Amen. Where has joy shown up for you in adoption?
Watching my kids just thrive and do well. And also, it's really joyful to me as well to have a relationship with some of their birth parents and to co-parent with them. I think that that's really special.
Describe adoption in 3 words.
Oh God, lately you caught me on a bad day. Frustrating.
That's okay. Go with it.
Painful at times, beautiful at times, and just, love, around the kids, all those other things that are difficult. It just comes back to keeping kids safe, keeping them happy.
Thank you so much for being part of this podcast. Before I let you go, you just said a word that was a trigger for me. So I want to do a PS, and I may or may not include this in the podcast, but you just said the word co-parent. Tell me what you mean, because that's a very scary word for a lot of people, and I would disagree with it, but I want to hear what your experience with that word is.
Mutual respect, respecting parents that maybe struggled in the beginning but are in a good place in their lives now and wanting to have a relationship with their child. I personally am a kid who was not raised by her biological father, and it always, was never talked about in my family. So that created a lot of misunderstanding about, what that meant. And so, talking a lot about birth families and the reasons why, parents maybe made the difficult decision of adoption, whether it was chosen or not, and working with the birth families of some of my kids to ensure that they know their family, they know where they came from, so they don't have those questions. And if they're able to, making decisions in their care together so that they feel like they're part of my family, because if they've given me this beautiful child, they're part of my family.
So you have gone to them to help you make decisions?
Yep.
Awesome. That sounds like more of an openness relationship than necessarily parenting your child in an everyday capacity. And that can look like anything you want it to look like together as you're growing your relationship. I just didn't want, and I suspected that was the case, but I wanted to just ask, did you agree to parent these children together with everyday decisions being both of yours versus you are talking about something a little different than that? Like they didn't say, well, we want to be part of all the decisions in their lives.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
more just respecting,
Yes.
the family
Okay.
values and that piece.
Awesome. I'm glad I asked. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast. Glad we got to talk.
Thanks.
Thank you. So here are the golden nuggets I'm taking away from my conversation with Teresa. Prepared beats scared. Opioid exposure isn't the worst case story that the internet sells you, and it isn't nothing. For most kids, it lands somewhere in the manageable middle, and the families who do best are the ones who start early, trust their gut, and refuse to let anyone brush off what they're seeing. Teresa asked the right question. What's the harm in being prepared? None. That's it right there. Be prepared. If you're at the start of your journey and you're trying to figure out whether a consultant is the right call for your family, book a complimentary adoption strategy session with my team. The link is in the show notes. We'll tell you truthfully whether it's a fit and what we'd recommend either way. But most importantly, we're going to help to prepare you so that once you become an adoptive parent, you know the right questions to ask. Follow the Adoption Roadmap wherever you get your podcasts, and find me on Instagram at the Adoption Roadmap for tips, education, held space, and joyful celebration. And if you loved this episode, please leave a rating and review. It truly fills my heart. It lets others learn this important information. And who knows, you might just hear your name at the top of a future show. Adoption is not just a destination. It's a journey filled with love, resilience, and growth. Wherever you are on this roadmap, trust in your path. Stay open to learning and always lead with your heart. You already have everything you need to create a beautiful story for your family, and when the road takes unexpected detours, I'm here to help you navigate every turn along the adoption roadmap. Thanks for listening. Tune in again next week. Bye-bye.